Jake and Lucy didn't dare look back as they ran through the dense forest, their breath ragged and their bodies gripped by fear. In 2014, a man named Jake Pattinson and his wife, Lucy Stone, were spending a weekend together on Vancouver Island, something they had done many times before. The couple had a lot of experience on the island and with camping in general. Vancouver Island provides an optimal setting for camping because of its mix of scenic beaches and dense forests. They had enjoyed many successful camping trips on the island until something truly terrifying happened on their final outing. Jake and Lucy were far from any roads or civilization, enjoying the solitude. They set up camp on a beach, a good distance from anywhere, and kept a fire going. To reach the trail leading away from the beach, they would need to walk a kilometer along the shoreline, and then another 2 kilometers through the forest to reach the road. Earlier that day, the couple had met another camper, Taylor Lautner, from New Zealand. He was planning to sleep in his van, which he had parked up on the road. They invited him down to the beach for a fire, and the three of them shared a bottle of wine, chatting around the flames. As the sun began to set, things started to take a creepy turn. The trio kept hearing what sounded like female voices coming from the bushes behind them, where the beach met the forest. It wasn't completely dark yet, so they assumed it might be other hikers or campers nearby, or perhaps even voices carrying from a boat anchored offshore. Regardless, all three of them could clearly hear the voices, and they all agreed they sounded female. As it got darker, Taylor Lautner decided to leave before it became too difficult to navigate the trail. He said his goodbyes and hiked back to his van, while Jake and Lucy stayed by their campsite, tending the fire. Lucy, feeling increasingly uneasy, insisted on keeping the fire burning. The strange voices continued into the night. They sounded like 2 women speaking, but the words were completely unintelligible. Worse, the voices seemed to be coming from just beyond the tree line, as if someone or something was lurking nearby. The couple stayed up late, keeping watch. Only when the voices finally stopped did they decide to put out the fire and head to their tent. Before going to sleep, they scanned the cove with a flashlight, searching for any boats that could have been the source of the voices. But there was nothing in sight. At around 3 a.m., they finally lay down, exhausted and ready to sleep. But just 15 minutes later, they heard footsteps near their campsite, right by where the fire had been. The footsteps came from the direction of the bushes, moving toward the inland area behind them, a part of the forest that should have been nearly impossible to traverse on foot. Jake and Lucy lay completely still, hoping it was just an animal. The only bears on the island were black bears, which were typically timid around humans. But as they listened, the footsteps moved from the fire over to their tent, then back into the woods. 5 minutes later, the footsteps returned. This time, the couple could hear 2 female voices, speaking in a loud, incoherent manner. Their speech didn't resemble any language Jake or Lucy recognized, and it sounded like they were talking over each other, almost like a nonsensical argument. Even more unsettling, they were doing this without any light to navigate through the dense forest, far from civilization. The voices moved from the fire pit toward the tent, still speaking loudly. They stood just outside the tent for a few seconds, then suddenly went silent. Then, without another sound, they retreated into the woods. Jake and Lucy lay frozen in fear for what felt like an eternity. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and they fell into an uneasy sleep. They didn't wake up until around 11 a.m., shaken and exhausted from the night before. Without hesitation, they packed up their things and left, never returning to that campsite again. Looking back, they probably made the right choice, to stay silent, not drawing attention to themselves from whatever, or whoever, was outside their tent that night. Jake and Lucy didn't dare look back as they ran through the dense forest, their breath ragged and their bodies gripped by fear. Towering trees loomed overhead, their thick branches blocking the morning light, casting long shadows on the damp ground. Every twig that snapped beneath their feet felt like an echo of something unseen behind them. Jake's dark green flannel clung to his sweat-soaked back. The white t-shirt beneath it nearly soaked through. Lucy's cream knit sweater was torn where branches had clawed at it, her black leggings flecked with mud. Their lungs burned as they pressed forward, the fear of whatever had lurked outside their tent the night before driving them on. When they finally reached the clearing where Taylor Lautner's van was parked, they came to a screeching halt. They expected Taylor to be there waiting for them, but there were footprints, no discarded belongings, nothing to indicate that Taylor had ever been there at all, just his parked car that looked like it had been abandoned for months. For a moment, the silence was oppressive. Their stomachs felt empty as they scanned the empty streets, hoping for some sign of their friend. But there was nothing. The sense of isolation grew heavier with each step as they made their way to the nearest town, a quiet, foggy coastal village. The streets were nearly empty, save for a few fishermen setting up their boats at the docks in the early morning. The air smelled of salt and wet wood, the tide rolling in with a soft, rhythmic thump against the shore. They found themselves in a small bar, its faded wooden sign swaying slightly in the breeze. Inside, the smell of old liquor and burning wood filled the room, the dim lighting casting flickering shadows along the walls. Jake and Lucy couldn't quite put their minds to what had happened. They could still hear the voices in their minds, the strange, indistinct whispers that had circled their tent in the middle of the night. Footsteps, the unnatural silence, the heaviness of the air pressing down on them like an invisible force. Then, as the bartender set down his glasses, he finally spoke. His voice was low, his tone meaningful. And with each word, the weight of what had happened sank deeper into them. They had not escaped the island unscathed. They had not met Taylor Lautner. Whoever or whatever had been with them that night was something else entirely. For years, Jake Garfield and Emily Watson had been avid hikers, exploring the dense forests surrounding their hometown of Raven Creek, Oregon. The two had always enjoyed the thrill of uncovering forgotten trails, abandoned cabins, and old logging camps deep within the woods. But one October evening, they found something they wished they had never seen. It started as a normal trip. The autumn air was crisp, and golden leaves crunched beneath their boots as they hiked through Windermere National Forest, a vast expanse of woodland that stretched for miles. Their plan was to follow a barely visible trail they had discovered on an old map, one that led to what was rumored to be an abandoned hunting lodge from the early 1900s. Locals spoke of strange occurrences in the area, stories of eerie whispers, shadowy figures, and missing hikers, but Jake and Emily were skeptics. They loved the thrill of a good ghost story, but they didn't believe in the supernatural. After nearly 3 hours of hiking, they stumbled upon a clearing. In the center stood a small, decayed structure barely holding itself together. The wooden walls were splintered and cracked, the roof caved in on one side. Faded antlers were nailed above the doorway, weathered and gray. Carved into the wood beside the door was an odd symbol, a rough, jagged spiral surrounded by what looked like claw marks. The door creaked open under Jake's touch, revealing a room filled with decay. The floor was littered with shattered glass, rusted cans, and old animal bones. The stench of damp wood and decay clung to the air. Against one wall was a crumbling fireplace, and in the center of the room, an old, rotting table. But what caught their attention most were the markings. Hundreds of symbols like the one outside, carved into the walls, floor, and even the ceiling. A flashlight beam traced the carvings, illuminating fresh etchings that suggested recent activity. Among the debris, Jake picked up a small, worn book. Its leather cover was cracked with age, and its pages were yellowed. Inside, handwritten passages detailed rituals, descriptions of offerings, sacrifices, and invocations to something referred to only as the Watcher in the Trees. The air outside had shifted. The usual sounds of birds and insects had disappeared, leaving an unnatural silence. The trees, once a comforting presence, now loomed menacingly. The setting sun cast long, eerie shadows as they hurriedly retraced their steps, but the landscape around them looked unfamiliar. The trees all seemed the same, towering and twisted, their gnarled branches clawing at the sky. The rustling sound started softly, creeping through the trees. Then it grew louder, branches snapping, leaves crunching. Something was moving toward them. Panic set in, feet pounding against the ground as they bolted through the undergrowth, the noise keeping pace with them, never falling behind. A glance over the shoulder revealed a figure among the trees, tall, impossibly tall, its limbs elongated and skeletal. Its face was obscured by shadows, but its eyes, two glowing, hollow pits, were fixed on them. The overgrown road appeared ahead, a desperate lifeline. They ran, lungs burning, muscles screaming for relief. At the road's edge, the presence behind them seemed to hesitate. Without stopping, they followed the road's path, the sounds of pursuit fading into silence. Headlights appeared in the distance, Jake's car. Relief flooded through them as they reached it, scrambling inside and locking the doors. The time on the dashboard clock made no sense. Hours had passed when it felt like only minutes. The book was gone from Jake's backpack, leaving only the unsettling feeling that something had been watching. Later that night, Emily researched the symbol they had found at the lodge. It appeared in ancient folklore, associated with entities known as the forest dwellers. According to legend, those who entered their domain and disturbed their sacred sites would be marked, followed, and watched. That night, the branches outside Emily's window tapped against the glass. Her bedroom was on the second floor. Two glowing eyes stared up at her from the tree line.